is the Rocky Flats Oral History Project. I am interviewing Melinda Kassen. That's how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
It is the 24th of May, 2006. I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and we are at Melinda's office at Trout Unlimited in Boulder. So Melinda, to start, if you could just tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, education, how you ended up in Boulder, that sort of thing.
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and went to college at Dartmouth in New Hampshire and to law school at Stanford in California. And after one job in California, I had spent summers here as I was growing up, and I wanted to be in the mountains. So I got a job in Colorado at the Attorney General's office, and with the exception of a brief stint for 2 years in Washington, D.C. as Hill staff, I've been in Colorado since then.
And I guess if you could tell me how you ended up becoming a Rocky Flats person, when you first learned about Rocky Flats and what your role was, and I understand you were involved with some of the activist community that was worried about Rocky Flats.
Yeah. In 1986, I started working for the Environmental Defense Fund, which has an office here in Boulder. And one of my jobs at the time was working on the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which is all about where is the nuclear waste from civilian power plant facilities going to go. And there was a huge national conversation about where this stuff was going to go. Was it going to go to Nevada? There were 12 candidate sites around the country. And so I was dealing with the Department of Energy, and I mean, this is now Yucca Mountain. All right, so I was dealing with the Department of Energy, I was dealing with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, was dealing with EPA, but it was all on the civilian side. And I don't know, I'd probably been at EDF for 6 months or a year, and this woman walks into my office and says, you know, we see you and we hear you about all of these nuclear waste transportation issues, but you know there's a bomb plant right here, and what are you doing about that? And they're applying for permits. And this is a woman, her name is Jan Pilcher. I don't know if you've spoken to her, but she was, you know, a mom in Arvada who had no particular environmental or technical training, but she had started to hear about the plan, and she had kids, and she was downwind, and I think she went to Smith or something, and she just started doing research on her own, and she started reading all of these documents, and she became, you know, an outraged activist. And so she was looking at the time for attorneys, for, you know, sort of environmental establishment attorneys, to become involved with the hazardous waste permitting at the site. Now, that's the acronym for that is RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, but the site needed a permit. And so she talked to me, she talked to Adam Babich, who may have still been at the Attorney General's office. I mean, she was talking to a number of people, trying to get someone in the mainstream community to be engaged. And over the course of the next couple of years, I guess she reeled me in.
Now, the site needed a RCRA permit. Did it not have one already? Was this a new regulation that federal facilities, defense facilities, also had to comply with RCRA, or they just?
The RCRA passed in 1976. So permit applications were due in 1980. Because, you know, you pass a new law, the EPA's got to put the regulations in place. I mean, it was a new program. And in 1980, and this is, this is great. In 1980, the site said they could have a de minimis permit. Now, you have to understand, on the one hand, Rocky Flats is one of the 10 largest consumers, emitters of carbon tetrachloride, a known carcinogen, in the world. On the other hand, they were trying to parse the Atomic Energy Act and some of the other statutes, and the DOE had come up with a theory at the time that because 90% or 95% of the hazardous materials they used were mixed with nuclear materials, that it didn't count. That if it was mixed with nuclear materials, they didn't have to get a RCRA permit. They only needed a RCRA permit for their pure hazardous materials. NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, took DOE to court over this at Savannah River in 1983-84, and they won. And so it was sort of in the aftershock, the wave after that litigation, that all of a sudden Rocky Flats is coming forward and, not happily, but dealing with the fact that they needed permits.
And so they were applying through the EPA, is that right?
State permit.
Okay.
It's one of those programs where there's a federal program and it's delegated to the states.
Okay. And when you say that Jan Pilcher reeled you in, how did she do that, and what did she reel you into? Well,
I mean, she came in and she talked about the RCRA permit, and I think at the time, I don't remember, I think I probably said, go talk to Adam Babbage, who was at the Attorney General's office, who's now an environmental law professor at Tulane. But she kept coming back. What about this? What about this? And when I think we Environmental Defense Fund solidly got involved, there was a proposal to build an incinerator to incinerate waste. And I worked with Richard Dennison, who is a toxicologist in our DC office, about the problems of incineration when you have a mixed waste, because it turns out that if it's too hot, you volatilize the organics and send them up the smoke. And you can even volatilize the radionuclides and send them up the smokestack. If it's not hot enough, then you have the organics turning into toxic other chemicals, other forms. So there was the pitch that we made, and this is sort of EDF, scientists and lawyers looking at the regulations and the science of the incineration, was there's no safe way to do this. There's no sweet spot in terms of the temperature that you can run this at where you're not going to have toxic byproducts. And that established us as having a different kind of voice than the citizen activists who were just sort of, oh my God, there's this huge plant that's got all this bad stuff in it, and it's in our backyard, and it should go away. And so we tried to create a role for sort of that wouldn't allow DOE to come back, or the contractor to come back and say, well, they're just NIMBYs, they're just whining about this. We tried very hard to do it in an EDF kind of way, which meant science and law as opposed to emotion, and to try to talk to the plant and the regulators in terms of the legal framework that they had to follow and the science, as opposed to on an emotional basis.
So was the incinerator something new, or they just now?
No, it was new. This was new.
Okay. And they had to have a RCRA permit?
They needed a permit for it.
Okay.
And it never got built.
So this is different than the incinerator that they said they were burning, the midnight burning and.
This was to deal with waste, the kind of waste I think that now goes to WIP.
Okay, got it. So what was it like taking on Rocky Flats?
Well, it was, as an environmental activist, you look for things that have real environmental consequences, that have a storyline that you can relate to the media so that the public understands what's going on and that the public cares. And it's always useful to have a bad guy in those stories. And there was no better bad guy than DOE and the contractor. These guys, it was such an amazing target because they were so belligerent. There was so much hostility and outrage from within the establishment that the hoi polloi should be saying anything about what they were doing. When I started doing this in the late 80s, I learned about something called the Myers-Briggs test, which is a personality test. And it's about whether people are introverts and extroverts and whether they want to negotiate solutions that are open-ended or closed. And it's ways of looking at the world. And people are one of 16 types. And the research that I looked at the time, that I became aware of partially as a result of this experience, is that the DOE nuclear engineers are this one type, and it's some tiny little fraction of the population. And the hoi polloi, most people were one of 3 or 4 types. And it was as if it was sort of a classic situation. What this personality test is designed to do is to try to demonstrate to people that the person that you're talking to, who you're screaming at or yelling at, is not crazy. They have a different way of organizing their view of the world. And DOE at the time, in the late 80s, didn't get it. They didn't understand what Peter Sandman would call the perception of risk. The DOE people said, the risk of a catastrophic accident, the risk of releases, the risk of something going wrong at the site, at least with regard to outsiders as opposed to workers, is tiny. What are you people so upset about? And what Peter Sandman would say is, well, these people are upset because they didn't know about it and they didn't choose it. And folks are much more likely to go drive a car knowing that there's a risk of dying in a car accident, and they don't get upset about that in the way that they get upset about something that's imposed on them. And that has huge consequences, although highly unlikely. And I think that the problem all throughout the late 80s and early 90s for DOE and for its contractor was they couldn't get that. And what that meant for those of us on the outside fighting about the RCRA permits and Superfund and releases and stuff was like shooting fish in a barrel. These guys were so great to be opposed to, because they went into decide, announce, defend mode. And this is an institution, a whole industry that had never had to deal with the public. They were horrible at public communications. They were horrible with regard to public comment. All of a sudden they had permits that needed public comments, and you would read their documents, and the documents had already decided things that theoretically weren't supposed to be decided until the end of the public comment period. I mean, it was fun because they were so bad on the other side.
Did you feel sorry for them?
No, I didn't feel sorry for them because the contamination was real. And I mean, there was sort of the contamination of workers, and I'm sure you've talked to old-time flats workers, and the cancer clusters and blah blah blah. I mean, for workers there was danger associated with that, but for the people who lived around these facilities, even to the extent that the economies were tied to the facilities, to all of a sudden find out that there's tritium in your drinking water or there's plutonium in the soil, I mean, people were upset. And this, you went from the country went from knowing nothing about the nuclear weapons complex over the course of the 80s and these lawsuits, to seeing the nuclear weapons complex on the front page of the New York Times on a weekly or at least monthly basis over the course of a 10-year period. And the agency always looked bad. So you don't, as an advocate, usually things are much muddier and it's much less good guys versus bad guys, but the DOE weapons complex guys managed to look like bad guys.
Were they bad guys?
Well, I think they were very frightened by the notion that they were going to have to be regulated, and they hadn't really thought about environmental consequences. And you have this incredible brain trust that put together our nuclear weapons complex on the one hand. On the other hand, they had this big blind spot with regard to the things that were not directly a part of the mission. In other words, the things like environmental contamination. And it's not as if we weren't also dragging all kinds of industries kicking and screaming into the environmental area, but these got environmental sort of era. But these guys, because of the protection that they tried to use under the Atomic Energy Act, didn't start until 10 or 15 years after the rest of American industry. And B, it turned out that they were bigger. I mean, the DOE weapons complex, cleanup of the DOE weapons complex is bigger than the entire civilian Superfund program. So it was big and it was nasty. And Colorado, if you live in Denver, you had sort of at the four corners of Denver, there were 4 big Superfund sites, and 3 of them were military. Well, you had Rocky Flats and the Arsenal, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, where they had made biological weapons, chemical weapons. We didn't even have water quality standards to deal with those. We didn't have water quality standards to deal with plutonium in the water or plutonium in the soil. One of the things that I did at EDF was went to the state water quality standards setting agency and asked them to set plutonium standards. And DOE came in and said it's illegal. And the state was like, we don't care if it's, what I convinced this state agency to do was, they said, we don't care if it's illegal. It's not illegal. We don't care if we can't enforce these directly against you. We're going to set these standards so that you know what we expect and what being a good neighbor and a good citizen in Colorado means in terms of standards. And EG&G and DOE were apoplectic about this.
So this was after the raid.
No, this was, when's the raid, in 89?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, this is,
Rockwell was there before the raid.
well, all right, so this is probably, 91, 90,
Okay.
I was still at EDF, so it's 91, 90, 91. But yeah, and the cascading information that came out, DOE lost control. They certainly lost control of the message. And at Rocky Flats, after President Bush, first President Bush, said, we're not going to make W-88s anymore, on his way sort of out the door, there was no purpose. And, a lot of the other sites have tried in the subsequent 15 years to reinvent themselves as something else, but the Flats was a factory. It didn't, once you stopped making these weapons, there was no place to hide for them. They didn't have another purpose. They didn't have another mission. And you had whatever, at the time, 7,000, 8,000 people working there. There was a level of frantic activity and response to the juggernaut of, hey, these environmental laws apply to you. And, oh, by the way, you're not making this stuff anymore. Jim Kelly, there's a TV show from the early 90s called Countdown to Shutdown. And I have that tape, Hannah, if you don't have access to it, which has got Romer and me and Jim Kelly, who was the head of the union at the time. And Jim Kelly makes this pitch for, we're not going to be strong unless we start making these weapons again. It was just sort of disconnected from what was happening in the community and what the feeling was and where the press was. I mean, I was on TV every week during this period, practically. Certainly every month with the monitoring council meetings. And the fact that there was 13 metric tons of plutonium upwind of a city of 2 million people when I started this, and there's a prairie out there now, I feel pretty good about that. Now, a lot of it had to do with Gorbachev and President Bush as opposed to what the activists did. But I think the fact that the activists were there means that this is a field now and not something else.
How do you had mentioned that you had a different role than the grassroots activists. How did you work with them, and how did you feel about your relationship with them?
Well, I tried, the grassroots activists liked a lot of the things I did, and they got angry at me about other things. And when Congress created the Defense Nuclear Safety Board, John Connolly's board, and John Connolly was coming out to hold a hearing, I got a group of activists, I got him to agree to sit down with a group of activists to talk about sort of his role and what they were going to be doing. And it's like I didn't invite everybody, and so the people that I didn't invite were really angry. I was trying to keep it, 10 people around a table, and, so I got slammed for having a secret meeting, and I was like, hey, I got a meeting with this guy who's going to be very important. You should be happy about that. But, and they were, there were certainly a number of the really grassroots folks who who were angry when I got appointed to the Rocky Flats Monitoring Council, because Roy Romer and David Skaggs very carefully said, well, we're going to choose her because she's rational and reasonable and can sort of talk the language and understands the regulatory framework, as opposed to one of the grassroots activists. And so there were a lot of grassroots activists who were angry because I was definitely chosen because I was not as radical. And I wasn't asking for the same things that they were. So on the one hand, on the other hand, when these monitoring council meetings would happen, and I got to do sort of free cross-examination of EG&G officials and score points, and the television cameras were there, and blah blah blah, they thought it was great.
So sort of love-hate.
Yeah, and then after I left EDF and went up on the Hill and got fired by the American people and had to find a job and ended up back at Kaiser-Hill, I got slammed by a lot of those people. And that seemed very unfair to me at the time. Westward wrote a half-page article called Changing Sides. And a couple of the people who were quoted in that article were folks that I hadn't invited to this meeting 5 years ago or 7 years ago, who were still angry about it. Leroy Moore wasn't in that article. The people who were the most involved didn't bite on that.
Let me backpedal a couple of questions, and then we can move forward. First question, you said these guys were all one personality type. I was wondering what it was.
Oh, what the Myers-Briggs personality? Well,
I took a guess, but I'm curious.
They're introverts. Right. What's the opposite of judgmental? They want it to be open.
There's P and J. Well,
they're P's.
They're P's. Okay.
There's science.
Right.
And there's
Well, there's I and E.
All right, so they're I's.
And then there's S and F, sensing and feeling, and S is like.
So they're S's.
Oh no, wait, is S? Yeah, S or N. So N is like big picture, and S is I did this years ago, but so they're S's. And then there's thinking and feeling.
And they're T's.
Right.
And then they're
J, perception and judgment.
And I don't remember on that one. I think they're J's.
I bet you they're J's. Yeah.
They're J's.
I wrote down ISTJ.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny that it's that easy to guess. And my other question was, you mentioned Peter Sandman. Who's that?
Peter Sandman, gosh, I think he's at Princeton. Mm-hmm. He does research on, I'm wondering, can you wait just a second to see?
Yeah. Okay, right, we're back on. So you had mentioned the Environmental Monitoring Council, and I was hoping that you could tell me about what it was, how you mentioned that you were chosen for it, and sort of what it was all about.
Well, I think that the politicians, when a politician perceives a problem and there's a lot of community anxiety, politicians have to react. And so Rocky Flats went from not being on anybody's radar screen to being a huge headache for the state health department, which does environmental permitting, a huge headache in terms of the mail that came into the governor's office and to Congressman Skaggs' office. And so they decided that one thing they could do to try to provide an outlet for some of the angst in the community, as well as to provide maybe to open a new communications channel, since DOE was so bad about communications. They decided to create this monitoring council, and that the purpose of this monitoring council would be to have monthly meetings and maybe a newsletter, and that the council could ask questions about sort of the topics, the important topics, what you saw in the media, and maybe by disseminating information and getting information, there would be a perception that the site wasn't trying to hide everything, and B, that there would actually be answers to questions. So, and I don't remember, maybe it started right after the raid. Maybe it started in '88. Honestly, I'm sorry, I don't remember. I was on it until I went to DC in early '93. And so there were monthly meetings, and EG&G and DOE would come make presentations about sort of whatever the permitting issue or the issue was at the top of the agenda. And during that period, there was always something. There was always some regulatory action. There was always some permitting issue. There was always some concern. So there was never a problem in coming up with topics, agenda topics. And who you had on it, and I'm not going to remember everybody, there was David Getchus, who was an environmental law professor, was on it for a while. And then Larry McDonald, who ran the Natural Resources Law Center at CU, also an environmental lawyer. The two of them, I mean, that was one seat. One of them was there for a while, and then the other. There was me as an environmental activist. There was a businessman developer who he developed Denver West, and he had cancer. So he was a big proponent of radiation for health. And, you know, honestly, I don't remember all the other people who were on it. But it was supposed to represent a range of views. Some people who actually knew who were engaged and who knew something about the site, and other people who were just community leaders, businessmen, academics, whatever, who were willing to be engaged and to think about these issues and to spend time. And we had monthly meetings with the site, and then we had planning meetings, and eventually there was a staff person and who put out newsletters or press releases. But so, I mean, the showpiece for the council was that there were these monthly evening meetings where there were 7 people on the monitoring council, and then people from EG&G primarily, and DOE as well, would come and make presentations on a topic, and we could ask questions. And I asked a lot of questions, and there was a lot of churn in the management at the site. So Rockwell was there, and then EG&G came in, and then EG&G had a couple big shakeups. So I know you want to know about the plutonium and the ducts. I mean, part of what happened there was there had been some information about plutonium in the ducts that had been made public at one of the monitoring council meetings. And at a subsequent meeting, I asked the former admiral, who was now in charge of nuclear waste and who literally talked about stowage. I mean, he'd been on a submarine for a long time. And I asked him, well, so how much is there? Because we had gotten 2 different numbers at the council. We had gotten, like, there's 8 ounces of plutonium in the ducts, and there's, I don't know, less than a pound, but I mean, so maybe, or there was like 1/10 of a pound and a pound, you know, there might be
all the ducts of all the places.
All the ducts of all the places. And he said at the meeting, I'll get back to you. And 2 days later, he called me, sure enough, he called me in my office, and he said, 64 pounds of plutonium in the ducts. And what he was looking at was a report that had never been made public. But it wasn't classified. So he didn't know, because he was a new manager at the time, he didn't know that what the public had been given before was this tiny little number. And so he didn't understand when he called and gave me this piece of information, which, you know, landed on the front page of the New York Times, that it was totally, that it was gonna be such a big deal, because the report that he was looking at wasn't new. It was a year old, and so he was trying to be responsive and, you know, in the spirit of the council and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure it was a horrible experience for him, because, I mean, this is a call that came in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 4:30 in the afternoon, and I immediately turned around and called every reporter I knew. And as I said, it was on the front. I mean, it wasn't as big a story as the raid, but it was a big story. And they were totally unprepared to deal with a firestorm. I mean, this was at a time when, you know, ultimately EG&G had, I think, 30 people in their PR staff. I mean, this was at a time, though, when they maybe had 2 or 3. I mean, they were completely unprepared to deal with this kind of scrutiny and with this kind of media circus.
So how did the subject first come up?
The subject first came up in a presentation that some low-level environmental compliance guy was giving to the Monitoring Council about accounting for plutonium in the waste. You know, how much plutonium is there in the waste? I mean, this was before, I mean, we weren't talking about the plutonium that was there for the pits. You know, the 13 metric, oh, wait for this. That's my clock.
Oh. With fishing noises.
Yeah, with fishing noises. Sorry. They didn't. So this wasn't talking about the 13 tons of pure plutonium that was there for the pits. This was talking, because that was classified at that point. This was talking about how much plutonium in the waste was there, and how much and was there any plutonium that was unaccounted for. And so it was in the context of that presentation that we got this, you know, well, there's 8 ounces or 8.4 ounces, and then there was another presentation, you know, a couple months later about, well, you know, there is no unaccounted for plutonium. So that then set up the question that I asked at the third meeting, where this was sort of the new management coming to talk to the council, and I want to say it's Admiral Burlingame, who was the EG&G guy who gave me this information. But, you know, I mean, I asked him the question, and he said, I don't know what I can tell you. I don't know what's classified and what's not. I will get back to you. And he called me 2 days later. That's great.
Probably not the moment that they wanted to decide to be responsive suddenly, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, it was an interesting story for the media, both because that sounded like a lot, and because it was entirely different from what they had said before. I mean, it was, you know, orders of magnitude different from what they had said before.
So how did they respond to the firestorm?
I mean, you know, then they started talking. Well, so then we had lots of meetings about how are you going to get this stuff out, and is it at risk? And you know, they came back and they talked about how sticky plutonium is as a metal, which is one of the reasons that you need to use so much carbon tetrachloride, is because it is sticky. And carbon tetrachloride is a solvent, and it's necessary if you're going to work plutonium. I mean, you know, the reason there are steel workers there is it's working metal. It's a very difficult metal to work. So, you know, then we had endless meetings about, well, how much of this stuff, it's not dust. It's not just getting blown around. You know, it's sticky, and it's entrained. It's stuck to the sides of the ducts. You know, I mean, they went about it in a very sort of business-like fashion, trying to convince people that it wasn't like the 64 pounds was, you know, the kind of dust that's in a vacuum cleaner that's just going to go out into the world.
So did you have acute clearance at that point, or were you able to review classified stuff?
No. I didn't get a clearance until I went to the Hill, until I left the monitoring council. And then I was on the Armed Services Committee, and I needed a clearance. So I didn't get a clearance until I went to DC. And then when I went to Kaiser-Hill, you know, it's like you have to give up your clearance in one position, but then I got it again at Kaiser-Hill. Not that I think I ever did anything at Kaiser-Hill that actually required a clearance, but everybody at a certain level in the management had to have a clearance, so I got a clearance.
What was that process like, getting cleared?
Well, you know, the first time around, they were worried about my drug history, and you know, I smoked dope in college, kind of thing. I mean, but it's a really long form, and it's tedious, and you have to come up with, I mean, it would be much easier for me now, but at the time, I had been much more mobile. And they wanted my addresses back to, I mean, it included law school, and I lived 3 different places or 5 different places in law school, if you count the summers. And coming up with all those addresses was like, oh my God. And how could this possibly be useful to anybody? And I had had a brief marriage that had fallen apart, and you know, they hunted down my ex, who had, you know, all kinds of horrible things to say, none of which were true, but I mean, it was like, it was an opportunity to try to hurt me.
One more time.
And so it was, I mean, it was a lot of information that was hard for me to understand how it had any bearing on whether I would be a responsible employee either on the Hill. And then at Kaiser-Hill, because I'd already had one, other than the fact that I had to update the addresses, it was sort of a no-brainer.
So anything else that worth mentioning about your experience on the Monitoring Council?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, the other person who I worked with about what I was going to talk about or what I was going to ask was Adam Babbage. Adam Babbage was, had been at the Attorney General's office after me, was in private practice, was doing environmental plaintiffs' work, and had a couple of these cases against the site for various, he's a RCRA guru, brought various cases, and we'd talk periodically about what he didn't think he was getting in discovery, and I could ask questions sort of for free up on the council podium and see whether we could force information. But no, I think it was, I certainly learned a lot, and what it did was it made me, it meant that I spent a ton of time working on Rocky Flats because of the council, because I felt responsible. It wasn't just about giving DOE a hard time. I read everything and we commented on everything, and I became very involved at the national level. There were these ongoing facilitated conversations about the weapons complex cleanup and the environmental management section of DOE, which was created at this time, and there were activists from all over the country and the attorneys general from all of the states where these sites were meeting with DOE and some contractor folks and the tribes about sort of the big issues. And so I became quite versed and active in that national scene as well as what was going on at the flats, because I just thought it was important to understand it. And I remember having one conversation with one of the top EG&G brass where I had like a Rocky Flats environmental impact statement for something, and I had another DOE environmental impact statement for WIP, for the waste site down in New Mexico. And they said different things about the same issue. And I pressed it at a public comment session, and he caught me in the hall. He's like, well, what are you talking about? Why are you giving me a hard time about this? And I'm like, look, one of the things about being an activist, as opposed to being, the contractor at the site, was I didn't just read about Rocky Flats. I read about everything that was happening in the complex. And when I put these two documents down for him, side by side, and he looked at it and he said, wow, I see what you mean. But even as the sort of one of the two deputy EG&G managers, second in command, he never looked at the WIP EIS. He only looked at Rocky Flats stuff. So I got a sense of the contractors, because they had very specific contracts, being sort of very, like they had blinders on, and they didn't understand the big picture. And that was an interesting dynamic, because on the one hand, they knew a lot more than I did about many things. On the other hand, they didn't get the big picture. And again, I think that's one of the reasons that they had such a hard time talking to the politicians and regulators.
Yeah, having done all these interviews, I've experienced, people do their job really well, and there are very few people you can talk to who had a real overview of what it all meant, which is sometimes confusing when you're
right.
doing these interviews. So you had said this to me off camera, but if you could just real quickly tell me about going to DC and your work there.
Okay. I worked at the Environmental Defense Fund starting in 1986. I took a break in the 91-92 academic year to teach at at DU at the law school. That didn't stop my being on the council. I came back for a year, and then I was ready to do something else. So I took a job as environmental counsel to the House Armed Services Committee for the 103rd Congress, which is 93, 94. And I went back to DC, and that committee writes the authorization bill, sort of the budget and the policy for what the weapons complex does. And my job was to focus on environmental management, both at DOE and at the Department of Defense. And just to give you some sense, the bill at the time, the defense bill, annual authorization, was about $260 billion, $250 billion. And there was $11 billion of environmental spending. So half going to the Department of Energy, half going to the Department of Defense. Now that was tiny in comparison to the bill, 3% or something on the one hand. On the other hand, EPA's entire budget was $7 billion. So it was the biggest chunk of environmental spending in the federal budget. And half of it went to DOE and half of it went to DOD. And so my job was to try to figure out what to do. And one of the things that we put in place in one of those bills was baseline environmental assessment, which people called the BEMER, Baseline Environmental Management Report, that required every DOE site to say, this is what our environmental issues are, this is what we're going to do in terms of cleanup, this is how much it's going to cost, and this is how long it's going to take. And to sort of have that requirement and look at it systematic, complex-wide, was a huge undertaking for DOE, but we thought important to try to get the agency to focus, especially at sites like Rocky Flats, which had no other mission, that they needed to sort of bring all of their resources and brains to this new task. And so the first BEMER came out, I don't know, in 1995 probably, or in late 94, but that was the timeline that you hear be contrasted with what actually happened at the Flats, because that was the timeline that said it's going to cost $73 billion to clean this site up, and it's going to take until 2060. That was the planning framework that then Kaiser-Hill came into in 1995. So I was on the Hill for 2 years, and then there was a change in leadership in Congress, and the new leadership decided they didn't want an environmental counsel on the House Armed Services Committee. So I had to find a new job, and there was no question that I was going to come home. And I actually was courted, at the time, EG&G was giving up the contract at the Flats, and there were 3 teams who were talking about bidding, and I actually got courted by 2 of those teams as I was leaving DC. And fortunately for me, I guess I chose the winner.
Were you entertaining other options as well coming back, or?
Well, I would have entertained any options, but as a practical matter, I needed a job. Mm-hmm. And I was single at the time. I needed to support myself. I, didn't have some big trust fund, so I needed a job. Environmental Defense Fund had filled my job, you know. What is how could that have happened? And I talked to people in the environmental community, and there were no jobs available in the environmental community. And Gail Norton was at the AG's office, and I didn't really have much interest in going there. And so this was the job that I got. I mean, I didn't really want to go into private practice. And because I'd been away, it wasn't like I was sort of thick in contacts, because I'd been away for 2 years. So this is the job I got, so I took it. I needed a job.
Were you looking forward to it, or was it just
well,
a job?
No, I mean, it was the interview that I had with George O'Brien, who was the first president of Kaiser-Hill. I talked to him about, I mean, literally, because it was a very funny conversation, I talked to him about bringing truth to power, that was going to be my role. Was, they were saying, ICF Kaiser and CH2M Hill, we're going to do this a different way. We're not defense contractors. We're not bomb builders. We're coming in here to clean up the site. That's what DOE says they want. We're going to do it differently, and there's a place for someone like Melinda. So they, I mean, it was a leap of faith for me, and a leap of faith for them.
Okay, well, we only have 3 minutes left in the tape, so
okay.
Maybe I'll just change it now, and then the next tape can be dedicated to Kaiser-Hill. So this is the second tape of my interview with Melinda Kassen. This is the Rocky Flats Oral History Project. It's the 24th of May. We're at Melinda's office at Trout Unlimited in Boulder. So we stopped just as you were going over to Kaiser-Hill.
Right.
I think if you could start, just tell me what your job was there, what you were hired to do.
What my card said was Counsel for Legislative and Environmental Affairs. And I came in like the 1st of February 2005, and CH2M Hill's offices down in Littleton in the tech center were the headquarters for writing the bid. We were writing the bid at that point. And that was sort of my first experience in the corporate world, and was like being on the Hill. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner brought in, and were there until late at night, just sort of going straight through to write this bid. And there was a general counsel who had come from the state of Washington, and there was another attorney in the counsel's office who had been an EG&G attorney and who sort of did labor and not environmental stuff. But he wasn't involved in the contract, in the bid process. Stan was there, who was, and me. But my portfolio was always sort of not just, or not being the lawyer for the site. And after we won the bid and started in mid-April, I mean, the first thing I did was go out and hire a RCRA Superfund expert attorney, because her name is Flo Phillips, and she works for one of sort of the follow-on companies to one of the original 4 companies involved at the Rocky Flats bid, although she's in Akron, Ohio now. But I was never going to be the person doing the nitty-gritty RCRA Part 235.1b to N kind of compliance stuff. What I did was work with, at the beginning, I worked with Dave Shelton, who was, I don't know what his title was, but he had been, Dave Shelton and I knew each other. He had been the head of the Colorado Department of Hazardous Waste Management. And so we had known each other before I went to DC when he was at the state. And they brought him back, and the two of us worked with Bob Card, who was the vice president at the time, on figuring out what we were going to do with regard to the Beamer, this, $73 billion 60-year cleanup, and was there another way to think about this? And the first task that we had was to renegotiate the agreement with the regulators. So there was, this was a negotiation between the state of Colorado and the deputy, the lieutenant governor was in the room, Gail Shetler, some of the time, EPA, and Max Dodson, who was the deputy regional administrator, was in the room. And Bob Card, Dave and I, Dan Miller from the state attorney general's office, and a couple people from DOE, including one from the general counsel's office, and Jesse Roberson was there. So that was that's what took the first year or year and a half that we were on site, was just to rethink and redo the whole structure of the agreement with the regulators, because the agreement with the regulators followed this. There were milestones that went out to 2050. It was a joke. It was total and utter joke. And we redid the Rocky Flats cleanup agreement. RFCA was sort of the accomplishment of this process. And instead of having milestones that went out 50 years, there were meaningful milestones for the next year or 2 years that got added to. And those milestones were tied to Kaiser-Hill's contract, because it was the first performance-based contract that that DOE had done. And that was revolutionary. And we actually got, so that's what I was doing on site. Mm-hmm. And then the other part of my job was to go to the Hill and make sure that Rocky Flats got money for cleanup. Because the dynamic within the complex more generally was that Rocky Flats was the factory. They didn't have sort of the cache of PhD nuclear engineers that all the other sites had. They didn't have the academic aura. It was the union. It was the factory. And as a result, they had never gotten the money that the other sites had gotten. And we needed to fight for the money. And this was a different kind of contract, and we weren't defense contractors. Nobody knew us on the Hill. Who are these guys? We didn't have the ins that the other contractors in the weapons complex had. And we needed, Bob wanted, and we wanted to have a performance-based contract that had a different kind of incentive structure. And we ended up writing legislation to allow performance-based contracts, because it wasn't that it couldn't happen. We had signed this contract that sort of looked like a performance-based contract, but we wanted to get sort of congressional recognition that this was going to be different. So I worked with CH2M Hill and ICF Kaiser's lobbyists in DC and was back there a fair amount. I worked on this for 3 years. The last year, I had an apartment in DC because I was there every other week working on this stuff on the Hill. So my job was to help renegotiate the cleanup agreement and then to try to tie that and translate that to the contract, to the 10-year, $6 billion cleanup vision of Bob's. And Bob started someplace. Dave Shelton and I would be in his office. It's like, no, you can't do that. Because Bob's, talk about a big picture thinker. I mean, Bob's a really big picture thinker and very strategic and has lots of ideas and knew there needed to be another way and that you needed to sort of break the mold and think about doing this in a completely different way. And the first thing that he came up with was the explode the buildings into their basements and leave them there. And, Shelton and I are like, that may or may not fly. But, and ultimately, obviously, that didn't happen. But we had, that's what we were doing. Figuring out how to actually get the cleanup done in a reasonable time frame, in a reasonable amount of money. Getting the regulators to agree on the path, and getting Congress to give us the money. And so those are the three things that I was the most involved with.
So who came up with this original Beamer 70 billion estimate? And what was it realistic at the time, or were the people just assuming it would never happen?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't here. I was in DC, so I don't know. But I think that they didn't. One of the things that Kaiser-Hill has done in the last 10 years is they've taken down buildings. And 10 years ago, nobody thought that was possible. I mean, people didn't know how it was going to be done. And certainly the defense contractors didn't know how it was going to be done. So the defense contractors, in their sort of defense contractor mode, said, well, the answer is we throw a lot of money at it.
As they're going with toothbrushes, that kind of thing.
They had no clue, and they hadn't really thought about it, and they didn't want to spend a lot of time thinking about it, and the whole point of the Beamer was to try to force people to think about it. But their first cut was, well, it's just going to cost a whole lot of money.
Mm-hmm. So did you guys pick apart what they did?
No, we didn't even use it.
They just threw a number out there. But was there any detail to that?
Yeah, there were timelines. There was this timeline, that had milestones in it that went out to 2050. It was absurd. It was a total fantasy. And I don't know who wrote it. Yeah. And all I know is that, Jim Werner and I looked at each other because I had known him when he was at NRDC and I was at EDF, and now he was working for Tom Grumbly in environmental management at DOE, and I was at the site, and it was like, okay, this is not working. It's not what's going to happen.
Was it like, was there actually a document? Was it like a 100-page document?
Yeah.
A 2-page document? Or
no, it was, well, for the whole DOE weapons complex, it was like a this big document.
Uh-huh. So there was some thought that went into it, but it was.
And it was delivered to Congress. I mean, part of this was, justifying the $5.5 billion that DOE was getting for environmental management, mm-hmm. when there were still, plenty of people on the Hill who thought that was nuts. Mm-hmm. Tiny though it might be, they still thought, in the greater scheme of the defense bill, which is now like $400 billion. I mean, why are we spending this money?
So But in addition to perhaps not a whole lot of thought having gone into that estimate, it sounds like what Bob Card and Kaiser-Hill did was just sort of approach it from a completely different angle.
Right.
How can you give some examples of how they did that?
Well, it was a much more sort of practical approach, and we started when I was there, I was only there for the first 3 years. We started not with the buildings, but we started with the outdoor sites. And okay, these are Superfund sites. Let's deal with them. The 903 pad, all the places where there was outdoor contamination. What are we going to do? What are the standards going to be? Let's put in the groundwater monitoring wells. Let's see where these plumes go. And just because it's got plutonium in it, plutonium's bad for you. So is carbon tetrachloride. There's lots of carcinogens. There's lots of chemicals that can kill you. We're not going to sort of treat this any differently in one sense because it's radioactive. We're just going to go about it and treat this like a Superfund site. And yeah, there happened to be, I think there were 13 Superfund sites within Rocky Flats. But we just started picking them off. Okay, all right, so this year we'll do these 3 sites, and here's how we're going to get there, and here's what there was a big fight about the standards. But here's where we're going, and this is what we think is realistic in the first year. We'll do 3 sites, and then the next year we'll do another 3 sites. And and so it was sort of break it down, treat it like a real Superfund site, and go in there and clean up, just like you clean up hot spots in mining areas, and you clean up hot spots down in the middle of Denver at the Asarco site where there's lead in the school playground soil. We just went in and did stuff.
Speaking of the cleanup agreement, that I understand that was a pretty contentious process, and I know that a lot of the activists that you worked with previously were unhappy with the standards. Could you talk about that a little bit?
And some of that happened after I left, but I think that where you had the state and EPA, while we were doing that negotiation, there was probably a lot more tension between DOE and Kaiser-Hill than there was between anybody who was in the room doing the negotiation and the activists. There was sort of the internal dynamic and the external dynamic. And with regard to the external dynamic and what the Peace Center and some of the other activists wanted was, this was one of these, do you set the standard at 0 or do you set the standard at something you can do? And what was frustrating to me about the Peace Center activists, because this wasn't coming from EDF or Sierra Club, I guess Eugene a little bit, but a lot of it wasn't coming from sort of mainstream environmental groups. And I was like, you guys, there's 13 tons of plutonium on this site. Let's get the plutonium out of here. Let's figure out how to bring the buildings down. Let's get the best standards, the best cleanup that we can, but let's get it done. And if it's going to be 0, it is going to take $73 billion and 60 years. If it's good but not perfect, then we can get this stuff out of here. And to me, it was more important to get the stuff out of there, to make the site go away. And it's, Leroy will say, Well, we just moved it somewhere, someplace else, and that's not good. You know, the big bad stuff. It's like, right, except that one of the things that was so awful to me about the flats was that it was upwind of a city of 2 million people.
Yeah.
And I mean, WIP's not perfect either. WIP's got all, you know, there's lots of potential for problems down at WIP, and there's potentials for problems at Oak Ridge where the you know, the plutonium metal is. And but there's not 2 million people sitting downwind of the plume. And I thought it was more important to deal with the big picture. And no, the standards were not what the activists wanted, but Eugene DeMeo and I have talked about this. It's like, it was important for them to be there. It was important for them to push as hard as they could to get the best standards, the tightest standards that they could. And ultimately, I don't feel badly about where the plant ended up. Is it perfect? No. There's still stuff in the soil. But is it gone? God, I mean, you weren't here in the mid-'80s. To me, it's amazing that it's gone. And the buildings are gone. And the buildings were the big, I mean, the contamination in the soil is problematic. It's long-term. It's there for a long, long time. You know, it's not infinity, but 250,000 years might as well be infinity as far as we're concerned. But the levels are, I think, acceptable to having gotten the really dangerous stuff. Building 771, building 371. To me, it was more important to get the really dangerous stuff out of there. And if we spent all of our time cleaning up to zero, we weren't going to get those big things out of there. And I wanted to get those big things out of there because I thought those were a hell of a lot more of a risk than whatever the picocurie limit is in the soil.
There was some sort of compromise made where initially the picocurie limit was going to be higher, and then they said it would be lower to 3 feet. Was that, or to?
And that happened after I left.
Okay.
I mean, I was really just there when we were getting this set up, and getting the money to do. I was much more sort of about the framework than I was ultimately about the nitty-gritty of the standards, because I left in April of '98, and a lot of these big fights over standards hadn't happened yet.
Okay. Was it difficult when you got there, being someone who had been an opponent of the plant for so long? Was it difficult to suddenly become an insider and change sides? And how did the people there treat you, and how did your former allies treat you? Well,
I think that, I mean, I was in the management building. I wasn't in, you know, I wasn't in the inside of the plant. I had very little contact. I had with workers. My world was in the management plant, working with Bob and Dave Shelton, and not sort of dealing with the workers. I do know, I mean, when I started, Bob Fewig, who was the head of, who worked on water quality compliance, and who had been, he may have been a Rockwell employee. I know he was an EG&G employee. He was kept by Kaiser-Hill, and then eventually he devolved to one of the, you know, the smaller contractors. And I don't know what he's doing now. He sits on Boulder's Water Quality Advisory Committee. You know, they had a big banner up with a statement that I had made at one of the hearings on setting plutonium standards in their offices. Well, they had to take that down.
What did it say? What was the statement?
I mean, it said, "I'm a lawyer. I don't know, and I don't know enough to answer that question. I'm just a lawyer," or something like that.
And with your name on it.
Yeah. And we might,
was it there when you went in, or they took it down?
No, they took it down. They told me they took it down, though. I mean, it's like, oh, well, you know, we knew you were coming, so we had to take the banner down. So I think, you know, the union guys, I never had any contact with. The environmental compliance people, I had to work, obviously, to gain trust. And but people like Bob Fewig and I ended up being friends and respecting each other and being, you know, working together as colleagues. And the guys who really couldn't deal with me, I think, either A, didn't stay. I mean, you know, the guy who gave the report to the monitoring council about there's, you know, only a couple ounces of plutonium in the ducts. I mean, he wasn't there by the time I got on site. When Kaiser-Hill came in and chose who to keep and who not to keep, they didn't keep people who, and someone like Alan Schubert, who had been sort of environmental compliance middle management at EG&G and who did stay, you know, we learned how to work together. And when I saw him at the closure party in December, you know, he's up in Idaho now. I mean, he came up and gave me a big hug. I mean, you know, I'm good at what I do, and I'm smart enough and competent enough that once the mission changed so that I was allied with a mission, I helped. And people saw that I helped. And so I was accepted by those people who I worked with. I'm sure there's people who would not say that, but I wasn't working with them. The people who I was working with were fine.
And what about the grassroots groups? You mentioned that you know, there had been the article and all that. I mean, if you ran into them in the street, were relations chilly?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, some of the two of the people who commented for that article were no longer in the Boulder area, so I didn't see them. And Leroy and Eugene and Tom, I mean, we were always civil. I'm sure they think I'm nuts, you know, but they were never mean. I mean, Eugene is my optometrist. I see him every year, you know, and I saw him every year throughout that whole period.
This is an earlier question, and we discussed it a little bit, but this is the question about the different approaches between grassroots groups and the national environmental organizations, and I guess Kaiser-Hill, you know, maybe we could just throw that in as well, to issues like risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis, federal standards for permissible exposure versus what people feel should be the standards, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. First of all, by the time Kaiser-Hill took over, I mean, EDF didn't continue to work on Rocky Flat stuff after I left. So, and the Sierra Club had activists involved, but they didn't have lawyers and scientists involved, professional staff. And, you know, by 1995, the whole wave of getting DOE to wake up and realize there needed to be a different paradigm, and they needed to deal with the cleanup, and they needed to deal with their pollution. I mean, it was over. A lot of it. So the national environmental groups, they're still engaged with DOE on a variety of issues, but not so much on these issues. And I think that, you know, the grassroots with regard to something like standards, yeah, they wanted the tightest standards they could have. And if I had been at EDF, I probably would have been arguing for the tightest standards possible too. I wouldn't have been as upset maybe if I didn't get them, because it's all about power and pushback, and I think that, I mean, when I was at EDF, as I said to you before, we followed a different path, but it's good to have folks who are there because they care and they're emotional and they're passionate and they have beliefs, core beliefs. I mean, the Peace Center activists have core beliefs about the evil nature of the facility. That's very different from having lawyers and scientists saying, you can't burn this. I mean, it's not as value. It's not a value approach. It's sort of the same drab regulatory approach that the bureaucrats take, and it was important to have, I think, both of those. At Kaiser-Hill, sure. I mean, Bob Card, initially wanted to explode the buildings into their basements because it would be cheap, but and he was just desperately trying to think of other ways of coming at this than 60 years and $73 billion. Mm-hmm. So I learned an awful lot from him about thinking outside the box, about baselines. I mean, here's a guy who makes big presentations to his board, the Kaiser-Hill board, and gets shot down, and like within 2 seconds is back saying, okay, what about this? I mean, I've never seen someone so able to move on and say, if we can't do it this way, let's do it, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I think that the Kaiser-Hill team, because they weren't defense contractors, I mean, by the time I can't tell you, I mean, we talked about the Sandman stuff. I can't tell you about what the people at EG&G or DOE thought about risk assessment. I know that the DOE lawyers are incredibly risk averse, and we had a lot of fights with the DOE lawyers at the site because it was like they saw their job as saying no to anything new. No, you can't do that. I mean, every time we wanted to change the way they were big defenders of the status quo, and it was hard for them. There were lots of meetings, Hannah, that I didn't go to because the non-attorneys said, well, if you come, they're going to have counsel there, and we don't want general counsel office there, so you can't come to this meeting. You tell us what to ask, you tell us what to say, you tell us what to do, but you can't come be in the room because then we'll have to have general counsel. I mean, the general counsel's office was seen as a huge barrier, but that was more about Flo and I saw ourselves as problem solvers. How do we get this done? What possible way can we think of to move forward? And the DOE counsel's office frequently saw itself as risk avoiders. We don't want to take on any more liability. We don't want to put anybody at risk. We don't want to get a lawsuit. We don't want to get this. So there were just two very different approaches on the site between Kaiser-Hill and DOE. And I don't think that was true necessarily in environmental compliance. I don't know that it was true between Jesse and Bob. It was true between us, between the lawyer staff. And that was an ongoing process and an ongoing headbutting. But the cost-benefit analysis, I told you, I mean, my cost-benefit analysis was I wanted to get those buildings out of there. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get the 13 tons of plutonium out of there. And if that meant to get there, we had to accept slightly higher standards in the soil, that was okay with me because I just thought the buildings were a much bigger danger. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but I don't know that I have a better answer.
Yeah. I guess there's a question of risk assessment, like risk assessment versus risk aversion with the DOE doing things the way they've always been done, and then sort of the risk to the refuge worker that they always talk about at Rocky Flats. Are those two different kinds of? It seems like there's risks to human health, and then there's risks to institutional power or something.
And I was much more focused on the latter than the former. Because we needed to move forward, we needed to change DOE's comfort zone. And I think Tom Grumbly was very happy with the new contractor. I think there was a lot of resistance at DOE with having, these weirdos who were not defense contractors, they were cleanup contractors. I mean, there was a lot of culture clash on the site. And when I was there, I think probably more focused on that than I was on the grassroots. I knew the grassroots were out there. As far as I was concerned, they were doing their job. Fighting for the lowest possible standards, for the least possible risk to the outside. That's their job. That's what they do. And they needed to be there, and they needed to be strong, and they needed to be, in our face all the time. And that helped push the numbers down.
Do you think DOE changed? I mean, you always hear of the Hazel O'Leary years as a time of increased openness and flexibility, and then I guess you saw Bob Card then go to DOE. Did that change as an institution in those years, and because of Rocky Flats, the changing contract in particular, or is it always just this battle between the entrenched people there and the people who come in and try to change things? I
think that Jim Warner would argue that Hazel O'Leary lost her job because of this contract, because she bucked the establishment. And I think that, I'm sure that Bob Card learned an awful lot when he was there. And one of the things that he learned was about the limits of changing an institution.
Yeah.
But just like, I learned an awful lot in my 2 years on the Hill. I don't know that DOE's changed. I think that, it's like, I work now with the Bureau of Reclamation, who used to be all about delivering water and power to farmers. And they've got a different mission now. I think it takes a long, long time. But at the same time, it was an exciting and interesting time in the 10 years, 12 years that I worked on these issues, because with the end of the Cold War, it forced a whole bunch of stuff that wouldn't have happened, and a lot of the people who were comfortable with the status quo couldn't stay in this. The status quo couldn't be maintained because we weren't making weapons anymore. So they had to get into this. It's like they didn't have a choice. All of a sudden, we weren't making weapons.
Right. If you could just describe to me, I have all these questions sort of about what it was like at the plant. If you could describe sort of what it was like, coming on site the first time, and I don't know if you visited a lot of the buildings, but what they were like, if you did, and sort of what morale was like, and sort of the security and just the whole physical experience of being there. Yes.
Well, it was hard for me. You have to show your badge going through the gate on the way there, and the whole thing was sort of eye-rolling. But as a practical matter, Hannah, I wasn't in the secured area. I didn't work in the secured area. And I think in the 3 years that I was on site, I was maybe inside 2 or 3 times. Mostly I was in an office building, which was a really ugly, old, yucky office building. But I wasn't in the heart of the plant. And the couple times that I went in, yeah, it was a pretty awesome thing to go into the secured part of the site with the levels of scrutiny, and and then going into the hot parts of the building, doing the tape up and getting all of the gear on and stuff. I mean, we didn't have meetings in there because it was a pain to have meetings in there. The guys who worked in there every day, if there was a meeting that we needed to have, they came out because it was easier. I mean, we only went in there when we absolutely had to go in. So I was there for 3 years, and as I said, I mean, I think I was inside the secured zone maybe 3 times.
What were the buildings like? I mean, had you been on an industrial site like that, or a secure site like that? Yeah,
and I had been, because I'd been working on the complex, I had been at all of the DOE facilities, all the big ones, and had been on tours, including at the flats. I mean, the monitoring council, we went on a tour. So I had been in the buildings, and it's pretty weird. Watching people walking around in zoot suits, it's pretty weird. The whole notion of being in a building where, inside the glove boxes, the air pressure is regulated so that if there's a breach, the air rushes in, not out. It's not like any other. I mean, there are other industrial complexes which have their own incredibly high standards, but they're for very different reasons, and it's bizarre. But when we got there, I mean, there were guns, and because they're and barbed wire, and they did these exercises about breaches of security and what would happen if a terrorist got in, and but that was pretty distant from where I was. As a practical matter, I wasn't there.
Yeah.
I wasn't in that part of the site, and I didn't have to go there to do my job.
What was the architecture like the buildings?
Ugh, 50s, yuck. I mean, cinder blocks. There was one newer building that was 1970s that, I mean, it was hideous.
Yeah.
The office buildings, what was that, 880? They called our building the squirrel cage. Give you some sense of what the architecture was like.
So I'm just always amazed at the sheer number of buildings. I mean, and I toured it after a lot of the buildings had been taken down, and you didn't go inside the buildings, but just saw sort of these, these squat, sort of flat things. And I was the pipes. That was the other thing that sort of astonished me.
All that ductwork.
Yeah.
All those pipes.
Yeah, I guess you knew a lot about that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess we're starting to wrap it up. Anything that any anecdotes, incidents that we haven't covered about your time on the site?
I don't think so.
So why did you leave, and where'd you go?
Oh, well, I left for personal reasons. I had a baby in October of 1997 who died, and this was after this period where I had been doing a lot of traveling back and forth to DC, and that wasn't what happened. I mean, that wasn't the cause, but that was a horrible experience for my husband and I, and I sort of I took 2 months off. Would have been my pregnancy leave. I took 2 months off and came back, but I really wanted a job where I didn't have to travel at that point. So I started looking for a job, and the other part of what I'd done at EDF was water, and so TU was starting a water project, and I got this job relatively easily, and left the site in April of '98. So I was back for like 4 months, but it was just, I needed to not be away all the time. So it really didn't have anything to do with the site. And we had done RCRA, we had gotten this legal change about performance contracts. And in one sense, all the stuff you're asking about, the nitty gritty of taking buildings down, and I mean, I don't know what I would have done there anyway. I mean, it was a good time, I think, I was about setting up a structure that would allow this to happen, and I did that. So it was a fine time for me to leave anyway, I think.
Did you miss it when you left, or were you?
Did I miss it? No.
Are you proud of the work you did there?
Yeah, I mean, and I went to the party in December. I think it's awesome. I mean, as I look at my career, the fact that Two Forks Dam and Reservoir didn't get built, and the fact that Rocky Flats is gone are the two things that I'm the most proud of. I mean, it's thinking back to 1983 when I got to Colorado as a new young lawyer. I mean, the notion that either of those things would have come to pass, were way out of bounds. And the fact that Rocky Flats would be gone was simply not on the table. I mean, the day that Jan Pilcher walked into my office, it's like the notion that this whole 7,000 person, 100 building site with 13 tons of plutonium would be gone. It's incredible. And to the extent that I played a role in that, I'm proud of that, and I'm happy that it's gone. And I understand that the stuff, doesn't go away, but I'm glad that it's out of this major metropolitan area.
I have this question: was it a safe place to work? Was it safe back then? Was it as?
Well, it was safe for me. I mean, I wasn't the one who was in the hot zones with, a pipe of plutonium liquid going by my head. I mean, I was in an office building. It was a perfectly safe place to work.
But even before that, like when Jan Pilcher came into your office, I've heard a lot of people say how safe it was, how their industrial safety record was so good.
You talked
risk assessment, things. Maybe it is, but in terms of like, was it safe then, and is it safe now with all the buildings gone?
Well, it's a hell of a lot safer now.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question that it's a hell of a lot safer now. But was it safe then? The guys who got cancer would say no. The guys with berylliosis would say no. I know that both the union and Rockwell and DOE would all say, yeah, it was safe, given how toxic it was. I mean, it's a hell of a lot safer than mining. What have we had? 30 people die in mine accidents?
Yeah.
Sort of depends on what you're comparing it to.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to accepting risks, workers accepting risks, workers accepting, and people accepting risk. I mean, if you lived in Arvada across Indiana from the site in the 50s when the fires were, you didn't even know that it wasn't safe. But those people were plenty angry by the late 80s.
This essay by report by Peter Sandman, was this something that you commissioned?
Mm-mm. No, he was doing this work.
Okay.
But we brought him out to talk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I got him to come talk. I talked to Nancy Tour, who at the time was doing HR, before she became the site manager, and convinced, and talked to her about getting Sandman to come talk to the management so that they would understand
what the public sees. Did that?
Yeah.
And this was Kaiser-Hill management.
Yeah, I think.
And did it resonate with them, or did they already know this, or
I think it probably helped.
Yeah.
Reminded them maybe of things that they might have known.
Okay, I think that's pretty much it for my questions. Any photos, memorabilia?
I looked at this. I should have looked at this before I came to the office, and I apologize. I mean, I have a on our walls in our house, I have a couple of the original cartoons, including the one about the plutonium and the ducks that ran in the Denver Post that Mike Keefe did. And I also have, when I left, they had a big party for me, and they gave me a closure, the picture of the site without the flats there. You know, 2010-year, $6 billion project. Picture that everybody signed. All of the people who I worked with signed. And I mean, I think even when I left in '98, the notion that it was really going to happen was still not something that I had entirely grasped.
Have you been, I guess you still can't go out to the site and stroll yet.
I don't know that I have any real desire to go out
You ever will?
and stroll. I mean, you know, it's
Hike there or something when it becomes a...
It's a harsh environment. I had, there's wind out there like you've never seen before. I had more windshields damaged during those 3 years than I've had in the rest. I mean, I haven't had any other windshields damaged except for the 3 years I was out there. I had 3 windshields shattered. It's a harsh environment.
What was the most difficult? And you talked about, I think, like get the sense of your proudest accomplishment and what you enjoyed about working there and the whole process. Was there anything that was really difficult for you?
Well, I mean, I had never worked in this was my one corporate experience, and just sort of, and even though I'd been on the Hill, and the Hill is certainly, you know, a huge enterprise, I had been pretty independent on the Hill, and they gave me a lot of freedom at Kaiser-Hill, and I had a fair amount of freedom at the site, you know, in terms of what I was doing. But I think being in corporate culture and just working for a huge, you know, 1,000 people corporation and dealing with some of the bureaucracy that's inherent in that was hard for me, because it's very different from working, you know, for a little shoestring environmental group.
Yeah, you know, I had one question that from the very beginning that I, how did you decide to get into environmental law?
I think I knew I come from an activist kind of family, and I knew I was going to be active on something, and I spent time doing some women's issues stuff. My first 2 years out of law school, I was a prosecutor, and I was prosecuting domestic violence cases, and that was too hard. So I needed to do something else. So I sort of, you know, and there was an opening here at the AG's office in environmental. I mean, I think I talked to the antitrust guys because there was an opening there. And I mean, I was just, I wanted to do something that was activist oriented.
Okay. And one final question. I've spoken with some workers who feel that there's these cesspools underneath the ground that have been still left that are deep, you know, where they bury all sorts of solvents and radioactive stuff. Did you guys, were you part of the sort of mapping of that stuff, and were you aware that there was stuff down there, or do you get the sense that a lot of workers just were sort of trying to perpetuate their jobs and continue cleaning up? Or
you know, there's people who say a lot of things about the site, some of which there's evidence for and some of which there isn't. You know, you can talk to Adrienne Anderson about there's Rocky Flats waste at Lowry, and there's plutonium in Denver's water supply because of Rocky Flats stuff going other places. I suppose it's possible. I think they did an awful lot of you know, Kaiser-Hill did an awful lot of assessment at the site. I think it's unlikely. I mean, I think that all of this nasty stuff, you would see it in the monitoring wells, and there's no evidence that it's there. So I don't lie awake. I was a lot more concerned when we had 13 tons of plutonium on the site than I am now.
Okay, well, that's it.
Okay.
Anything else?
I don't think so.
Well, thank you very much
Sure.
for doing this. Appreciate it.